Okay, everyone, we're going to get started now. Today's webinar is Monetizing In-Building Networks with CBRS, and we're very lucky to have two prominent figures from the CBRS world with us today, Andy Clegg from Google and Jay Floyd from MGM Resorts. Welcome, gentlemen, and welcome to the webinar. Next slide, Pete. I'm Rich Berliner. I will be moderating today. Let's go to the next slide, Pete. Some notes before we start. We will do whatever we can to answer your questions during the webinar, but if not, we will answer them during the Q&A session. Please use the GoToWebinar control panel if you'd like to ask a question, and they will be relayed to me. We are recording, and we'll publish a link to the recording within a few days. Also, today's slides will automatically be emailed to everyone. If you'd like more information about this topic, please go to connectedremag.com. And I'd like to welcome everyone and get started with our webinar today. Next slide, please. So before we go to this slide and let Andy talk about CBRS and some background, I'd like to just start with Jay. So Jay, how did you get here in terms of looking at CBRS? I know a little bit about your background, and you came from a carrier, but what's given you an interest in CBRS, and why now?
Thank you, Rich, and thank you for all those that are attending on the webinar today. Yeah, as stated, my name is Jay Floyd. I'm from MGM Resorts. And that's a great question, Rich. It's one of those situations where historically, let me take everyone back, several years ago when we were in a state of, managing our Wi-Fi environment, leveraging many different partners in a very complex scenario for services across, a large property portfolio of hotel casinos. And when you get into a situation like that, some of the things that you have to consider are, what does your roadmap look like from an infrastructure standpoint? But two, is it still going to be, a situation where you're costing the company money from a capital standpoint, and is there a way of potentially that infrastructure, those wireless services self-sustaining, right? So when we talk about revenue, those are some of the things that we started to consider early on. And so moving on, adjusting the, really had, the environments that we operate, whether it's, whether it's traditional two-way radio, Wi-Fi, distributed antenna systems within our properties, and the cellular enhancements, we really needed to factor in emerging technologies. And a few years back, when we were exposed, I actually had run into some former coworkers of mine, and we started talking about some of the newest technologies, and that's when CBRS came up. And from that point, working with the CBRS Alliance on Go, their efforts, working with other peers in the hospitality and casino industries, understanding what that environment now looks like, we started to integrate that into. And when we looked at the potential of, what that could offer from a value standpoint to MGM Resorts, it was tremendous, not only from potential OPEX savings, but new services that we could not only extend internal to our enterprise, but also potentially out to our guests, which is, foremost our number one priority. Guest experience within the property is without a doubt the number one driver, and leveraging what we need to do from a technology standpoint to support that. So with that stated, our current situation now includes CBRS. We're excited to stand up some upcoming trials with CBRS and Wi-Fi 6, and we're excited about the the scenarios that we'll be testing, and eventually the deployment of CBRS infrastructure within our environments towards the end of the year. But
so we want to get back. I'm sorry, Jay.
No, I just want to say it's a complex situation, so that's something that we also have to consider.
Gotcha. Yeah, we want to get back and we'll talk to you more about this, but what I'd like to do is introduce Andy and let him talk a little bit about what it is. So I love telling this story that I was with a very prominent commercial real estate person in New York about a year and a half ago or so, and we started talking about in building and what was going on and how he was planning out the future for his spaces. And we talked about DAS and we talked about a whole series of things. And then I asked what he thought about 5G, and he said, well, tell me what it is and I'll tell you what I think. And we went on from there. And finally, at the end of the lunch, I said, well, what do you think about this CBRS stuff? And he looked at me and said, I have no idea what that is. So kind of the dawn of commercial real estate folks, which is our basic readership, and the intersection of that and wireless is kind of interesting. So Andy, you know, I think I have a little bit of knowledge, but clue us in, what is CBRS?
Okay, thanks, Rich, and thanks, Jay. Yeah, so CBRS is a little novel compared to other kind of wireless applications. So I think it's worth it for the purpose of this webinar to give a 100,000 foot view of what CBRS is, maybe even 500,000 foot. I can only give you a very, very high level overview of what CBRS is. I encourage you to ask additional questions that we can address at the end or after. But my purpose here is to give a very high level view of what CBRS is, because you've got to understand that to understand your opportunities for in-building and other applications. So let's go ahead to the first slide. Okay, so what is CBRS? How does it work? So the important thing to remember or to think about is CBRS is shared spectrum. It's not all single purpose spectrum, and it's shared mid-band spectrum. Mid-band is a new term that the FCC likes to kick around that means the frequency is not too low, it's not too high. So propagation in terms of in-building coverage or macro coverage in outdoor areas is the propagation isn't as good as it is at low frequencies, but isn't as bad as it is at high frequencies, and sort of is a nice balance of its ability to penetrate into buildings and between floors and things like that compared to other frequencies. So it's shared spectrum, and we share the spectrum with federal government incumbents, mostly the military, and also some fixed satellite service earth stations, so big dishes that are used to distribute cable programming and things like that. Those are the two main incumbents. We have to share the spectrum, and we have to avoid interfering with those incumbents that are in the spectrum. So that's what makes CBRS novel. That's number one thing that makes CBRS novel. It's not single purpose spectrum. The other thing that makes CBRS novel is that there's two tiers of service in CBRS. If you want to, you can go and buy a license at auction, and that license is called a priority access license, or a PAL. You can buy that license at auction, and that gives you a little bit of interference rights and quality of service rights compared to the lower tier of CBRS. That lower tier is GAA, or General Authorized Access. And the interesting thing about GAA is it costs nothing. You can use it. You don't need to pay for a license. The spectrum is free. So you're getting the opportunity to access as much as 150 megahertz of prime mid-band spectrum and not pay a cent for it. And you compare that to like the big cell phone companies that have to go out and pay billions and billions of dollars for spectrum to operate their networks in. You have the opportunity to operate your network for free without having to pay anything for the spectrum. So the issue that the glue that makes all of this work is a thing called a spectrum access system, or a SAS is what we call it. So before any devices in this new CBRS service are allowed to transmit, they have to check in with a SAS, and they have to say, here I am, this is how much power I'm running, this is what my antenna is like. Let me know if it's okay to transmit when and where I am. And the SAS takes that information. It knows about the incumbent's operations. It knows about the other users of the band. And it replies to that base station and it says, yep, all things have been checked out and you're okay to transmit. Or in some rare cases, it may say, well, there's an incumbent operating in your area right at that time. You may need to choose a different frequency or something. But the SAS manages the interference among all of the tiers. So it makes sure that CBRS doesn't interfere with the military, it makes sure that the PALs don't interfere with each other, and it makes sure the lower tier GAA doesn't interfere with the PAL. But the SAS does that all behind the scenes, and if we do our job right, it's transparent to the user. The CBRS user doesn't have to think twice about a SAS. It's all done automatically in communications between the base stations and the SAS, and the user doesn't have to get involved if everything works as planned. And so far in initial deployments, things have been working quite well. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is just really kind of a diagram of how the SAS works. It's what I was just discussing in the last slide, but the little white boxes there are the base stations. We call those CBSDs, or Citizens Broadband Radio Service Device. So the picture is just showing the device communicating with this cloud-based spectrum access system, just to make sure it's okay to transmit. The spectrum access system checks with the FCC databases and also checks with the military incumbent activity, and make sure that that nothing's happening in that area that CBSD could disrupt. And then the SAS replies back to the CBSD and says, okay, you're good to transmit. And then that CBSD can then start communicating with handsets or other CBSDs or whatever. So it starts to provide the service after the SAS gives it the all clear. We can go to the next slide. So what is CBRS actually being used for? If you look online, there's lots of white papers and discussions about CBRS use cases. And those are all well and good, but a lot of those were created before commercial service began. Now that commercial service has begun, I can tell you what CBRS is actually being used for, rather than the kinds of things that people thought it might be used for. So we've seen it being used for entertainment venues, hotels, airports, shopping malls, enterprise networks inside businesses operating private LTE networks. It's being used in data centers. It's being used as a DAS alternative. It's being used for all sorts of indoor activities. For outdoor, we've seen it being used for NFL, Major League Baseball, NASCAR, PGA Tour uses it to get stats and shot link data back to its hub. It's used extensively now for rural broadband. We've got a lot of rural broadband users. It's being used in mines. And also some cable companies are using it to extend their service to people that they can't quite get cables to. And then there are the, both indoor, outdoor applications. We've seen a lot of activity on college campuses, corporate campuses, and then the big cell phone providers and the virtual network operators, the cable companies that want to get into the cell providing service, are also really big into CBRS. So these are things we've actually seen. These are deployments that are actually going on today, not theory, but this is what it's actually being used for. There's a lot of other things. These are the things that come to the top of my mind in the ones that I've dealt with so far. You can go to the next slide, please. So there are some timelines related to CBRS that you need to keep in mind, especially since some of these deadlines are coming up quickly. So we, the Spectrum Access System, the SAS providers, have been granted authority to operate commercial service by the FCC. We're just granted that authority just about 2 months ago. And so we are off and running. There's 4 spectrum access systems, competing companies that are running right now. So that means that in the lower tier, the unpaid, the free tier, GAA, commercial service is available now. If you want to operate CBRS in the GAA tier commercially, you can do that right now. We're ready and equipment is available. In fact, I've got a slide here about some of the statistics on equipment. But if you want to operate in the higher tier, the priority access license tier, that hasn't quite kicked off yet because the auction, the FCC auction for PAL licenses, hasn't occurred yet. The auction is currently scheduled for June 25th, and we're getting indications, actually we just got an indication today from the FCC that they plan to go ahead as scheduled to begin the auction on June 25th. So the auction's coming up on June 25th. They'll be auctioning up to 7 10 megahertz wide PALs in each of the 3,000 and some counties in the United States. So there's 22,000 and some total PAL licenses. The key thing is if you want to participate in the auction, you need to file an FCC Form 175 by April 9th. That's just a couple of weeks away, so you got to get on the ball. And then your upfront payments for your licenses are due May 21st, which is sort of half of your minimum bid that they've established. The FCC is going to hold a mock auction on June 22nd, and then the real bidding starts on June 25th. They priced the spectrum, the minimum opening bid of 2 cents per megahertz pop. So each 10 megahertz license will go for 20 cents times the population of that county. And on May 21st, you have to put up some money equal to half of that minimum reserve price. We estimate that the auction will take a while, several weeks to play out, and then there's some formalities that have to be done. Our best guess is that PAL operation will actually start around November of 2020. One of the things that I like to get across for people who are interested in CBRS is there's a lot of complexity. There's complexity involved in where the incumbents operate and some of the other encumbrances on CBRS spectrum. In a lot of areas, in most areas of the country, there's no encumbrances at all. But in some areas, there can be some issues because the Navy is very active there, for example, or there's a satellite dish right there in the middle of the city. And it's important that you understand those encumbrances. We just finished yesterday and posted yesterday a mind-numbing document that explains basically all you need to know about incumbents and encumbrances. It's not an exciting document. Read it if you need to fall asleep. But if you're going to participate in the auction, I highly recommend you refer to that document before you participate in the auction, so you're prepared to understand what you're going to get. So next slide, please. So do you need to buy a PAL for in-building operation? It's hard to say. I mean, every individual's situation is different. My take on it is not necessarily. The way the band is structured and the way the rules are written, in any given area, the plan is to make at least 80 megahertz of GAA spectrum available. In other words, the people who buy licenses cannot take all 150 megahertz. They can take at most 70 megahertz in a given area. That means that typically, subject to incumbent operations, there will be at least 80 megahertz left over for the free tier, for the GAA tier. The GAA can also opportunistically use PAL spectrum if the PAL is not using it. So PAL buys a county and they only put base stations in the north part of the county. The south part of the county will still be available on those same frequencies for GAA operations. So you could have potentially all 150 megahertz of spectrum available to you in some locations. That's not going to be typical, but it's possible. The other thing about in-building and the advantage of in-building is that in-building naturally has better coexistence with other GAA operators. One of the challenges in the GAA tier is that there could be 2 GAA CBRS operators in close proximity to each other, and they might interfere with each other. But if you're an indoor provider and you control the building, you will have your system inside, and because buildings tend to attenuate radio signals before they get out, or attenuate signals coming from inside before they get in, and the floors between buildings also attenuate radio signals, there's a good chance that you can deploy GAA in your building without suffering interference from other GAAs that are outside your building or down the block or whatever. So there's sort of this natural coexistence thing with in-building coverage that's kind of nice with regard to the GAA tier. But if you want to assure better quality of service for your operations, assure it, and you want to have a very high likelihood that spectrum will be available to give to you, very, very high likelihood, then you may want to buy a PAL for your county. And then that will enable you to operate on your PAL channel without getting interference from other PALs or from GAA. And keep in mind, it's completely within the rules to use both. If you buy a PAL, you can also use GAA. So if you buy 10 megahertz of PAL spectrum, you can also make use of whatever GAA spectrum might be available for your in-building application. So you can use both. It's perfectly legitimate to buy a PAL and also still use GAA in the same area. And then the next slide. I think it's gets to the wrapping up, or well, close to wrapping up. So equipment is available now. Of course, that's very important. There's over 31 models of indoor and outdoor base stations that we call CBSDs. There's over 61 models of end user devices, handsets and things. For example, the latest iPhone, the latest LG phone, the latest Google Pixel phone, and the latest Samsung handsets all support CBRS. And then there's a bunch of modules, IoT devices, and other devices that also support CBRS now. So there is the ecosystem out there. There's lots of equipment available. You can go to the CBRS Alliance website there and see a partial list of what's available. So that's a good place to look. And then finally, the last slide.
Yeah, Andy, we put that slide towards the end. We're going to go back to that later.
Right.
Excellent. There was a question. There was a question that popped up that I wanted to insert right here and you kind of answered it, and you might want to repeat this, is what is the frequency of CBRS? You mentioned midband. Just go into this 3.5 piece of it, would you?
Sure. Yeah, of course, you never know whether people are really going to be interested down at that level. The frequency of CBRS goes from 3550 to 3700 megahertz. So below CBRS is a government-only band that's used for other military purposes, radars on ships and things like that. And above the CBRS band is the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz fixed satellite service Earth station band, which is being transitioned to this new 3.7 gigahertz license service that they're going to auction at the end of the year. But that's designed for sort of high power macro cells, the traditional cellular model. So CBRS is sandwiched in between those two from 3550 to 3700. The PAL operations will only be allowed in the 3550 to 3650 megahertz portion. So up to 70 megahertz of that lower 100 megahertz will be PAL. They're not allowed in the upper 50 megahertz. So that upper 50 megahertz from 3650 to 3700 will only be available for GAA.
Gotcha. That's a great foundation for us to understand here, Andy, and I very much appreciate that. So Jay, I would be remiss in this situation, since we tantalized everybody and got so many people to sign up for this webinar about monetizing CBRS, if I didn't go into this with you in specific about monetizing. So we put a couple of questions together here, but talk to us about the monetization piece. How are you coming, what's the thought process for you? And I'm sure there's some things that you might not want to share, but what's the thought process of what the opportunity to monetize CBRS might be?
Yeah, Rich, it's a great question. So if you think about it, it's going to vary, obviously, depending on the business or the industry that you're in. What we do in the hospitality and casino industry and how we're looking to monetize CBRS is going to be different than, say, someone that has a portfolio of Class A commercial real estate. It's just different in that sense. But if you drill down into what you're trying to accomplish from a business, obviously there's potentially some opportunities out there to monetize CBRS. From our perspective, we're looking at growing this private LTE, the CBRS environment within our properties, not only for the internal enterprise use, but also to attract partnership. That partnership may be with other wireless carriers. It may be a roaming environment where, our roaming costs that we're presenting to a carrier may be, maybe slightly less than their traditional roaming partners that they have master service agreements with. It may be cable operators. It may be smaller MVNOs that want to roam onto the CBRS network that we deploy across our properties. That's one thing. Obviously, we're looking at additional partnerships, virtual presence, right? If you're a guest and you come to Vegas, you come to one of our MGM resorts, you're experiencing something that is, that is branded MGM. However, we want to make it, connect with you well, right? So if you have some sort of, use of a device or some sort of relationship with another company, if we can help support that virtual presence of that our property can do so. And that may be anywhere from, let's say you're a fan, you're coming in for sporting events, and we have, let's say it's a hockey game, right? And we have a virtual presence with all of the other hockey teams within our environments, whether it's special content that you're accessing through the CBRS network. There's an opportunity to monetize that. So those are just small examples of what we're looking at. It goes much deeper into the opportunities and the different channels that we're looking at, but it is definitely part of the overall roadmap of what CBRS can do for MGM Resorts.
So do you see an opportunity, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, do you see an opportunity to present a bill to a wireless carrier for completing calls in your facilities on your CBRS network?
Yeah, we actually do. If you are looking at, if a carrier is interested in either roaming or, traditionally in the past, it used to be, they would do Wi-Fi offload. Well, with a private LTE network in place, can we optimize that where they're now roaming onto our network? They're getting a certain amount of spectrum. As Andy had mentioned out, this is spectrum for us to use at no cost. MGM Resorts, the GAA model. So that is something that's very interesting to us, and how we can slice that up and leverage that to monetize certain portions of the network. I absolutely see opportunity there, and we've had these conversations with the carriers already, and they're continuing to build momentum as the wireless carriers, their capital environment strained to build out their 5G macro networks that they have, their outdoor networks. So that's something that is definitely on the horizon for us.
Gotcha. And how did you launch the test? In other words, what did you do to prep for this? You've got a background in this, so you weren't coming in, from without any wireless knowledge. But how did you sort of go about launching the test of what you're going to use in the buildings?
Well, it definitely helps to have a background, but if you don't, there's tons of external resources out there, partners that you can sit down with and discuss what that looks like to essentially become a mobile network operator. From our perspective, we leveraged our existing relationships with several key partners. We basically identified what the scenarios would be in the test. We identified what would be the milestones and what would actually be perceived as a successful test. And so having that documentation in place, following that model, and ensuring that you're meeting those milestones is very important, just to prove out the network, the services that you're transmitting, and then the use case internally as well. So a lot of things that go into a test. Obviously, if you've never done a trial or a proof of concept, I would highly recommend getting with a technology partner that can help you in that situation.
Gotcha. So can you talk through a little bit about the cost aspect? In other words, capex versus opex in doing this. CBRS, less money, more money, part of the DAS environment ecosystem that you're putting in. Talk us through that a little bit, because you are, as you mentioned, experimenting not only with CBRS, but with DAS, with Wi-Fi 6 and other technologies too. So talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, it's probably one of the important questions here, in the sense that the cost does not fit within the financials, then the technology becomes irrelevant. If the impact to our business, is not substantial. In other words, if I have in place now with Wi-Fi and cellular enhancements is not meeting the needs, and to this point it's not, because there's some specific issues that we're having with Wi-Fi, on the IT security side, and then with the cost of traditional distributed antenna systems. Those are aspects that we've evaluated, and we said, no, this doesn't work for us. What does the cost look like for CBRS? So if you look at those things, you start to evaluate the cost and the comparisons to Wi-Fi. The enhancements I get obviously are relevant to a private LTE network. No one can come into my property, put in a rogue access point and start broadcasting, and either they're doing some sort of man in the middle attack, or evil twin, those type of risks that IT security deems as malicious. We have a hard time controlling that, but with a CBRS environment, we obviously are the only ones that are really authorized to be transmitting in that GAA, as Andy had mentioned before, within the four walls of our building. So from that standpoint, those costs that are comparable to Wi-Fi, so you're looking at 50 to 80 cents per square foot. You compare that to DAS, which is anywhere from $2.50 to $4.50 per square foot. Now you start to see the value that presents to a business, and that's something that we are really keen on, and keeping a close eye on how this continues to evolve. There's other cost factors that we have to evaluate, but for the most part, we feel that the cost aspect surrounding CBRS is something that is worth the investment.
Gotcha. So either I'm getting better at these webinars, or you guys are the most interesting two people on the planet, but I've got more questions here than we've ever had for one of these webinars in the past. So though a really, really good one just came in that I do want to jump on, because you're heading right that direction. Do you anticipate CBRS replacing your DAS system in your casinos and in the hotels?
Yeah, that's that's a good question, right? And that is a question that a lot of people have asked in the past. At this time, because of the device, just the maturity of the device that supports CBRS is not at a level, and it won't be probably at the levels that we see where the majority of our guests and employees have that type of device capable of operating on on 3.5 gigahertz. We still have to maintain other networks such as DAS, such as Wi-Fi. However, that doesn't mean that we can't begin the potential of positioning CBRS as a replacement for the traditional distributed antenna systems that are deployed now. I think that what we're really looking to do within MGM Resorts is operate all of these wireless platforms on a common infrastructure. So for us, some of the things that we've done have gone back to the manufacturers and said, look, we need to ensure that we can support multiple endpoints, with a common connection back, to, and I hate to get technical here, but getting these connections back to those IDF closets that we have that, installed, landed on a switch and coming back to our core. We have to do that without excess equipment and excess cabling. And so if we can do that, then we can continue to operate multiple wireless platforms and really give an optimal experience for our guests. Their device in the future will be smart enough that it's going to be very opportunistic and choose the best network possible, and that's what we're striving for. And that may include any type of cellular enhancement. However, there is the opportunity to leverage CBRS as a replacement, or even a combination of CBRS and Wi-Fi as a DAS replacement in the future.
Gotcha. So I want to go to Andy for a second, because this question came in, and I think it's a great one, and it's perfect in terms of the foundation you set for us. Can you explain the pricing model of costs other than the Spectrum hardware, other than the diagram you gave us? Are there any other costs to it? So can you talk a little bit about core interconnection and those sorts of technologies, and what a company needs to actually put a CBRS system in, Andy?
Well, I mean, other than the backhaul, which can, just be a simple internet connection, the connection to the SAS is just over HTTP. It just takes a regular internet connection. So as far as backhaul goes, that's all you need. The other cost is, so the spectrum access systems do charge to get you an authorization. I can't speak for the other spectrum access system administrators. Google is one of the 4 that are currently approved. We announced pricing several months ago. It's pretty low. Our stock price is like $2.25 per CBSD per month. But for the big users or users that are big enterprise users and whatever, I'm sure there are discounts and things off that price. I'm not in the business side of the house, so don't quote me on any of that. But you can contact our business development team. But that's the kind of the range of price. And then the spectrum access system administrators currently are also offering sort of value-added services. Right now, every SaaS has to give you the same answer. We can't really compete on SaaS features during this first generation of SaaSes. We may next year, but first generation, there's no competition. We all have to do pretty much the same thing. But we and others offer network planning tools and network management systems and things as value add to help you plan and manage your network. Google takes advantage of its vast geo data that we have in helping you plan your network and coverage, and where buildings may block your signals and where trees may block your signals and things like that. So we offer that as a value add, and so but that's not a mandatory part of CBRS. That's just something to help you get going and plan your network. So really, other than a standard internet backhaul and the equipment costs, your only other costs have to do with the fees for the spectrum access system. So that's.
No, but I'm talking, Andy. I think one of the things that I'm aware of, and we deal. Many of our clients have talked to companies like Geoverse about the interconnection piece, all the back end, the core you need for this, the interconnection agreements, and those sorts of things that go with this, and also data collection. I'm talking about that back end piece of it. Yeah. So that may be something that you're not focused on as part of the SaaS world, but that's an important aspect of this, is it not?
Yeah, it is. So if you're offering 4G LTE, for example, you need an EPC as part of your formula. So you need an EPC provider to link up to. If you don't have that relationship already, that does have to be established. There are, some of the rural broadband providers are using proprietary interfaces and things that have a different kind of operational model and have different levels of costs associated with them. As you can imagine, the rural broadband providers are very cost sensitive. So there are opportunities using different types of over-the-air technologies and back-end technologies that you can sort of help manage the costs of those. But there's also, if you're going to provide a neutral host solution where you're allowing people from different carriers to roam onto your system, there are going to be carrier agreements in place and potential for revenue sharing, but potentially costs associated with theirs. So from those aspects, yes. From the non-SaaS aspect, yes, you need to investigate those. But that would be true regardless of which band you're using. But you do have to plan for those costs.
Yeah. Okay. So Jay, I think this is a good one for you. Is CBRS the same as private LTE? That is one of the other questions that came in, and there's been a bunch around that sort of idea. Also, is there a difference between 5G and CBRS? So you want to talk those things through?
Sure, I can, and Andy maybe wanted to chime in on this as well, but, is there a difference between CBRS and private LTE? I think it's kind of I don't say a misunderstanding, but CBRS is the acronym that the FCC has identified for the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, right? So private LTE, you can have a private LTE network using a different spectrum. We're just associating private LTE with CBRS. So when I speak, to an audience and I mention CBRS, and then I may say private LTE, I'm saying it as one and the same because I'm leveraging the CBRS spectrum to operate my private LTE network over that band. So It is, but it isn't, right? So think about private LTE as just the LTE is just the technology piece of it, right? So now we're looking at other carriers operate LTE networks. They operate at different frequencies.
Yeah,
Now when we
we're
talk,
aware of one of the companies, a company called Airwaves, that's made a deal with a satellite provider to use the satellite frequencies as a private LTE network. So yeah, you're right on with that. There are other alternatives that are not CBRS, but that are private LTE.
yeah, and good point. And when you're talking about private LTE, as Andy had mentioned, look, you have to maintain the infrastructure to support that network. You need the EPC, you need interconnection, all those things that basically make you a mobile network operator. You need to have those elements in place. It doesn't mean that you have to have an EPC within your own enterprise core. You can subscribe to that service, but those are the elements that you need to be mindful when you're starting to talk about private LTE. And then the next question you said was 5G, right? So
Right.
what is 5G? Well, 5G is, it's a lot of things to a lot of different people, right? I think that what we need to really concern ourselves with 5G is what is the infrastructure to support that, and what does it do for us? Well, the difference between LTE and 5G are, the two most prominent things are latency and throughput. Those are those data speeds that you experience on a 5G network are much greater, and the latency is much lower. So those are some of the key aspects associated with 5G. How you relate that to your business and what value does it bring to your business is something that you can evaluate internally.
Yep.
And
So,
Rich,
go
if I
ahead.
could
Please, Andy.
chime
Yeah.
in real fast. Yeah, a couple of important points to emphasize what Jay said. CBRS does not have to be LTE. They're not, the two are not coupled. At the moment, there's a lot of interest in deploying LTE in CBRS, but it's certainly not a requirement. It's a technology neutral band. You can deploy any digital technology in CBRS. There are no rules that prohibit you, and the way the SASs are created and the way the standards were created, we support any technology in the CBRS band. It does not have to be LTE.
So you're saying Jay and the hotels could use CBRS frequencies to run the private radio network for his employee.
Absolutely. The only requirement the FCC put on the band is that whatever technology you use has to be digital. So they couldn't use, analog FM walkie-talkies, for example, but they can use any digital technology in the band. And most, now most even walkie-talkies and things are now digital DMR or P25 or whatever. So those would absolutely be allowed in the CBRS band. Of course, they have to be authorized by a SAS, but they're allowed. The other thing with regard to 5G, just keep in mind, 3GPP, which is the global group that sets 5G standards, has already designated and standardized the CBRS band as a designated 5G band. It's 5G band N48. So it is already part of the 5G standard. It supports, at the moment, supports non-standalone 5G. There are people who are working on 5G deployments in the band. So CBRS is 5G ready.
Gotcha. Well, before I let you go, I don't want you falling asleep on us, Andy. This is a great question. How does E911 apply in the 3.5 band?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And honestly, I don't think I'm prepared to answer that because it's a bit of a sensitive, E911 is a sensitive topic everywhere. And I don't think I'm prepared to answer that. So I'd rather skip that question if we could.
Gotcha. No, that's I understand. So Jay, one of the questions that was in here was, do you think the penetration of devices on CBRS is sufficient now for you to use it as DAS replacement? I think you answered that before, but what's the time frame, do you think, on the cycle of replacement that's necessary so that you can have confidence in letting people use CBRS in the buildings?
Yeah, well, we obviously have to get the infrastructure in place first, but as you know, as I've been monitoring the device environment and the adoption of the 3.5 chipsets in these devices, I think there's 4 or 5 devices out now, and you know, there's a slew of devices that are on the roadmap. Even two-way radios, as Andy had brought the radio conversation up. Even those radios are, you know, integrating CBRS chipsets in those devices. So we are looking at, as we continue to build and deploy the network, we will, you know, augment, and we can do it property by property, but we will start to augment our move ahead our life cycle for devices and start replacing those enterprise devices that may be using mobile applications. That'll be our first use case of CBRS would be, it could be housekeeping using a mobile device running Hot Sauce, which is a mobile application for housekeeping. It could be you know, specific to our attendants that are on the casino floor that are leveraging another mobile application. It's, you know, those are really going to be the, you know, the primary use cases that we start to deploy these devices out in the CBRS environment. We're also looking at building automation and IoT as well, fixed wireless solutions. But it's something that's going to happen, you know, rather rapidly, and we're, you know, we're going to be challenged to keep up from a infrastructure deployment perspective. You know, from our business coming back to us saying, hey, we want these devices, we want these devices. So that's something that we'll have to manage appropriately. But as soon as we can get these networks deployed, we'll start deploying the devices, the end user devices to operate on it.
What about guests? So in other words, we really need a full replacement cycle of phones in order for, you know, the absolute replacement of DAS for CBRS. You couldn't just say, okay, if you want to use your phone in the hotel, you know, we have CBRS in the building, so therefore we don't need DAS anymore. So is that a concern of yours? And what do you think that time frame is to be able to, you know, make CBRS sort of ubiquitous in the event, in the hotels, casinos, and the venues that you guys operate?
Yeah, you know, the question of whether or not this replaces DAS is still something that, you know, will take time to mature. And I think that as we continue to deploy multiple wireless platforms and we leverage technology features such as open roaming to create that optimal connection for the guests, if we see value in continuing to operate DAS within our properties, I mean, if it adds to the to the guests and their ability for connection anywhere within the property, you know, that's just something that we're going to continue to do. Now, there's a cost associated with that, and we're well aware of that. But does that mean we're going to go out and deploy a brand new DAS to cover all of Mandalay Bay? Probably not. What we may do is start to look at certain areas of the property where we'll leverage DAS to be a primary wireless connection for a guest versus, say, Wi-Fi or CBRS, up to a point where we can start to look at creating that open roaming environment across our property, and it'll be seamless to the guests and their experience.
Got it. So, Andy, this is one for you. This is a mind-blowing question, and you know, there were 3 or 4 of them we can kind of group together. What about the IT and security aspect of this? The one question was, have encryption security platforms been developed? Another question is, how do you make sure that there's IT protection and bring the IT group from the company into the discussions on this? You want to take that and run with it a bit?
Yeah, I mean, you know, obviously information security is a huge issue, and you know, if we go down that rabbit hole, we could discuss it for the next several hours. But there are, so yeah, so from the perspective of so from the area interface perspective, start with there. If you're doing LTE, obviously we support all of the intrinsic security and encryption that supported over the LTE air interface or any other proprietary interface that's encrypted. So that's obviously supported within CBRS. There's nothing different about CBRS from any other band. I guess that's the way to look at all of this. There's nothing intrinsically different from CBRS from the over-the-air technology than there is in any other band. Now, if you're talking about the difference in security specifically as it applies to the architecture of the CBRS band, we've actually built in security from the SAS layer from the very beginning. In fact, the first document we standardized on back at the very beginning 4 years ago or 5 years ago was basically information security and network security from the SAS perspective and from the ecosystem perspective. Everything that the SAS communicates back and forth to the CBSDs is all encrypted. It's required. We have certificates that are required to be in place when the CBSD talks to a SAS and the SAS talks to a CBSD. So the security is ensured that nobody can spoof CBSDs or spoof users. There's certificate requirements if you're a PAL holder to identify yourself to the SAS. So from the SAS perspective, security is built in and enforced from end to end. User data is not shareable outside of SASs, so nobody can get information about, so if Jay deploys a bunch of CBSDs at one of his resorts, the public is not entitled to get information about the locations of those devices and things like that. And of course, with the rest, speaking from the Google SAS perspective, all of the data about, CBRS and CBSD operations is all encrypted, both in transit and at rest. So from the SAS layer perspective, which is the only difference of CBRS from any other LTE application, we have those security steps built in to keep the band itself safe and to keep the user and licensee data safe. But from all of the other IT security perspectives and things, there's no difference in CBRS from a physical air interface perspective than there is in any other radio.
Right. So one of the questions, Jay, I think this is perfect for you, is, and I think this is a kind of a backhanded compliment on this. What are the problems that MGM is experiencing with DAS and Wi-Fi that CBRS is solving? And I think you've said before that that's not the case. It's really not that there's an issue. It's that you want to use new technologies to assist in what you're doing. Am I right or wrong with that?
No, you're all correct. So, look, MGM has found itself in a very complex situation with the multiple third-party operators that we have agreements with from a DAS perspective. Well, one of the things that model does not do is it does not address the maturation of technology, right? So those guys operate an existing network for say 10 years. They're going to protect their margins, and so they're not going to reinvest into that network. They may come back and offer that, but it requires you to sign an existing agreement or another agreement, which obviously you have to extend certain aspects, certain terms to that vendor. So based on that kind of that restriction that we found ourselves in, we felt that CBRS was an avenue not only to deploy and leverage its technologies, but also provide a pathway to potentially exit some of those agreements in the future. And I think that is something we need to consider. It's not just technology that we're evaluating here. It's also the business aspects and how we operate within our company. So we have to evaluate those factors as well. It's a hard call for a lot of us out there who are enterprise companies that own property that are looking to deploy infrastructure, and the capital may not be there. So from that perspective, if you're in that situation, a third-party operator may be right for you in that sense and what they bring to the table. We're just trying to maneuver ourselves and position ourselves in the future where we're kind of controlling that environment, we're monetizing the infrastructure, and we're providing the best service possible within our properties.
Just so everyone's clear, so you can use CBRS for voice, obviously. You can use CBRS for signage. You could use CBRS for IoT. You could use CBRS for many different things. So you're not thinking about it simply as a DAS replacement at all. You're thinking about it in a much broader, wider sense, right?
Yeah, in a sense, the features and capabilities of CBRS and a private LTE network within our properties far exceeds what a DAS system or the cellular enhancements within our properties can do. You take, for instance, say there's a UFC fight at T-Mobile Arena, and we want to multicast that across our wireless networks, specifically CBRS, to enhance guests that subscribe to that, say at another MGM Resort property. They may be in their room, they may be in a gathering with a bunch of friends in at a restaurant. It doesn't matter where they're at. Their ability to subscribe to that content and be able to receive that content, those are some of the service elements that we're looking at to leverage on CBRS.
Gotcha. So Andy, just to jump over to you, this is a fantastic question about roaming. So can a person that's walking out of the casino that's been using CBRS indoors, how can they then jump to the external wireless network from the carrier, or maybe the network of the internal network that MGM has put out there on their DAS system? Does CBRS roam in the traditional sense that we think of?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, obviously, if you're both operating LTE, that's one of sort of the basic requirements. And you can roam onto other, well, it's more likely that you would be coming from a major carrier's network roaming onto the indoor network. Now that, of course, assumes that a roaming agreement has been worked out among the resort operator CBRS system and the macro network. But absolutely, roaming is fully supported in CBRS, just like it is in any LTE network. But also keep in mind that CBRS is not limited to indoor only. MGM, if it so desired, could extend its indoor CBRS network to outdoor. It can use higher power devices, higher power base stations outdoors, and can cover the outdoor areas of its resorts as well. So you don't have to necessarily roam on to a macro network as soon as you leave the door of the building. MGM can extend the coverage outdoors using category B higher power equipment. And they can do that both in the GAA tier or the PAL tier. So you can, for free, deploy outdoor networks to keep your customers on your network even when they're out and about in the vicinity of your resort. But traditional roaming, between a macro LTE network and an indoor CBRS LTE network is absolutely supported.
So, guys, we're getting up against the time frame, but we've basically scratched the surface of the questions that were asked. We are doing another event here at Connected Real Estate on April 22nd and 23rd. I've invited both of you to work with us on the CBRS panel. We'll be getting information out to the industry as time goes on that event on April 22nd and 23rd. To talk more about this and a number of other topics. We're doing sort of a virtual event as a replacement for some of the shows that have been postponed. But you guys have been terrific today. Pete, I think we had another slide with the list of SaaS providers, but I would like to make sure that everybody is aware. There you go. Everybody is aware that besides just the SaaS providers, there are other companies that are in the mix that do the other aspects, as we discussed, sort of the backhaul, the interconnection, the core for billing and data on what's going on in the network. But I want to thank you both. This was a terrific webinar. We got more questions than we've ever had before, and I really want to thank you both for attending this and being with me on the call on this webinar. And we will be sending out the slides, and we also will be sending out, we will have available in the next few days an audio recording of this entire event. Gentlemen, thank you both for being on today. And if there are any other questions, people are welcome to get a hold of us here at Connected Real Estate Magazine and ask more about CBRS. But we certainly think that this is a wave of the future. Guys, thank you so much. I appreciate you being on today.
Thanks, Rich.
Thank you, Rich.
Take care.